Hi, Shumi Majaz here, research student in England. This video examines qualitative study design. So, there are a number of qualitative study design from various traditional approaches. I include in-depth interviews in this video. The purpose of interview is to explore individual experiences and perceptions in rich detail. The second major approach, focus group. These generate unique insights into shared experiences and social norms through group discussions. Observations can be participants' observation or non-participant observation, where we are learning about behaviors and interactions in natural setting. We are studying the cultural aspects of a setting or a particular context. The last major qualitative study design is document review. This is the purpose of these studies, and this method identifies patterns of simulation, describing characteristics of organizations or processes based on in-depth and systematic review of documents related to the educational implementational policy of interest. Why should we use in-depth interviews? There are a few potential reasons. Interviews can eliminate various focal topics, and so we can think about using them when we are interested in understanding individual perspectives and experiences. Again, when we are addressing some thoughtful topics, it may be that our question of interest has some particular stigma to it, or for some reason may be sensitive, and we may find that the intimacy and trust and rapport that can be established in an in-depth interview is an asset in addressing such type of topics. We can also use in-depth interviews when there are concerns about fear of revenge. So again, the privacy of an in-depth interview might help us to address concerns about fear of revenge, and we can think about interviews, of course, when structured survey approaches don't work, when the topic that we are interested in doesn't lend itself nicely to check boxes and force choices options on a survey instrument. So let's talk a little bit about sampling. The aim in sampling design for interviews in a study is identify key format, refer to individuals who have knowledge of or experiences with the phenomena of interest, and then we know that the sample is complete, so it is not possible to identify a sample size in advance, and they are willing to speak about it. The goal in the sampling approach is breadth, attending a broad range of perspective, a whole across a spectrum is not representative. So we are not concerned with taking a random sample every next person on any setting. The sample size varies depending on the complexity of the inquiry, and it can be decided in advance. Sample size in qualitative studies and in-depth interviews, and in particular, is determined by the principle of theoretical saturation. And what is actually the theoretical saturation? It is a point at which no new concept work from the data, and so as we are collecting data, we're hearing now new ideas that emerging from the conversation. Here, I want to clarify one thing. Theoretical saturation cannot be always possible, specifically in the PhD studies. It mostly concerned with the interdisciplinary or with the uh, broad scale studies. Guideline to conduct interview. To conduct an interview is an attempt to obtain a target information. And it is a guided conversation. So we need to understand that in an in-depth interview, we may not always know the path at the interview is going to take. In fact, that is a strength of the method. At the same time, as the interviewer may need to keep a fence or some barrier along the edge of the interview so that the respondent does not veer off in a direction that's really not manageable. Another thing, what should we think about the interview guideline? It looks like we must think that interview guide as a framework for the interviewer. It is not a structured script that must be followed for the interviewer to use and facilitate. The conversation contains a list of main questions and then probe. So specific probes that help the individual to understand the intent of the interview. Now, what type of interviews or what type of questions? Questions are open and non-directive. This links back to the principle of qualitative research method that they need to be exploratory in nature or now or non-directional. The interviewer may diverge to pursue an emergent idea in detail. So if we think of that path through the interviewer is encouraged to diverge or move away from the interview guide in order to follow a lead that the respondent may offer up in his her comments. The interview may be reversed or interviewer can drop or add something or he can change the sequence of the questions. If we are looking at top performing educational institutions and success of students who have learning disabilities, and we were interested in understanding what the most successful institute were doing in order to have better outcomes in their setting for learners with disability. The design was to include high performing universities and low performing universities that did well and not so well for learners with learning disability, and to go to those institutes and in-depth interviews key informants at each university. Remember, there are people who are close to the phenomena of interest. So in this instance, it was the key academics in these institutes who were most directly involved in the teaching of such students. To conduct, look at the interview guide from this study. In this process, we will review the question itself and then reflect on the purpose of each question. So this is the first question and you can see that it is very broad. Adopting narrative methodology to explore emerging field. Let's start by having you describe what you do here. The purpose of this question is to provide a comfortable, non-threatening way into the interview. We also can locate the people in the organization from their own perspective. They describing to you when they do within that organization. And we can also gain a sense of their role in the larger processes of providing learning activities. Next question is what happens to a student with learning disability who comes to any university? The purpose of this question is to elicit a description of the university processes as well as activities available. So we are starting to get to the specific area of interest. We know we want to know what is happening within that university, what is happening within the walls of that university, and what type of activities are provided to a student with learning disabilities. And so they will begin to describe that process to us, means respondents. This question gives us an opportunity to explore a broad range of factors that the interviewer considers relevant to student learning in this setting, meaning we are turning it over to the respondent, students, or if we think that teachers are all also important to respond or to talk on this topic. Another example is, have there been efforts or guidelines to improve the teaching services for challenged students or bring some guidelines for them? This question is to explore the Institute's quality improvement efforts, broadly conceived, right? So, this doesn't script the individual and encourage the individual respondent to talk only about formal quality proven initiatives, for instance, but rather what other open door there might be follow up by probes that we could ask. As the respondent start speaking, we might want to know what got that started. How does the organization recognize problems or opportunities? Can you describe things that needed ironed out along the way? These kinds of probes can be used to encourage the respondent to keep following up a path of commentary. So let's have a look on some basic types of prompts that the interviewer can use during the conversation in order to elicit more information or to get clarification from the respondents. There is a range of these techniques available to interviewers, from being silent and quiet and nodding slowly and listening and just encourage through to asking various kinds of questions, clarification question, where you said the word, can you describe what you mean by that? And these probes should be used at the discretion of the interviewer. These are sometimes we need to repeat the last word. We can ask the respondent to repeat, say something more about any specific word or any specific statement, or when we feel that they are talking what really we want to listen from them, we can encourage them with some uh, really nice such type of word, or you can direct very nicely when you can say that, please can you tell me something more about this thing or this concept, or we can confirm their ideas by saying such type of word as, could you please say something more about your previous thing, what you already said? Means there are different ways and these are quite normal. The most important thing here involved is respect your respondent. And sometimes sometimes we can ask detail with the WH questions, but not too much emphasis on why element, because that's not a nice way to asking questions. Initiating interviews with participants. Before going to this process, what you need to establish as a research student or as a researcher. In order to generate richer detail from the respondent as it is appropriate, so conducting interview, what it is like when you get out of the field, you have got your interview guide and you are ready to begin collecting data. So beginning the interview, good rapport is imperative. Clearly, you are sitting in a one-on-one interaction. You are going to be asking the respondent about topic that has great meaning for him, her, or you. Here, you should give special attention to establishing rapport, means creating trust and respect. So, rapport is really imperative. Second, participants will only talk candidly if they feel comfortable in the space where they are. They trust the interviewer if they feel that the interviewer is from a legitimate organization, that the interviewer is genuinely interested in what the respondent has to say. The interviewer will protect their confidentiality, and the interviewer is there really to listen to them and not to judge them. So, careful attention to all of these dynamics in the very first seconds of the interaction is really very important. Without good rapport or with some courtesy in the dynamic or some discomfort in on part of the interviewer, it is not likely that the respondents in fact share the degree of information that you are really hoping for. The very beginning, the opening of an interview with the interviewee is introducing the study and its goals to the respondent. There are a number of things that the interviewer need to do in very first moments of interaction in order to encourage the respondent to feel comfortable in the space. Alongside it, you must clarify about why the participant was chosen and to describe the procedures, specifically the privacy issues related to the study and withdrawal policy. It need to be discussed that what time your participant can withdraw or what type of withdrawal is involved. Is it related to only participation or data collection as well? So we need to think very seriously our responsibility to identities. Several things we need to avoid when we are doing qualitative data collection through interviews. First is influencing respondents by asking leading questions or conveying one's own view. This seems obvious, maybe a very straightforward, is much more difficult in practice because we may have leading questions or convey our view implicitly or explicitly through our interaction with the respondents. And so we want always to be thinking about very broad. Why should we ask open questions? To just to get both positive and negative sorts of information or a statement. And so we want to hear all of the things that are going well. We also want to hear some of the things that are not going so well. So inviting the respondent to provide a balanced view just to do interviews. But the interviewer is in a tricky spot where you want to leave enough time for the respondent to express fully their thoughts. Sometimes people need to pause a moment, so you don't need to start commentary prematurely at the time. And so the tendency may be for the interviewer just simply jump to the next topic, and we want to be mindful of the potential loss of opportunities. Should we interrupt? The informant here sometime we do in our own excitement. Maybe speak over or ask a probing question or come right back on topic of a comment. Because we are in the momentum of the interview and we are started to get excited. So we need to exercise some restraint not to interrupt the informant. Tips for good interview. Where there are something that you can do that will ensure a positive interaction and yield very rich narrative data first. Knowing your interview guide and the potential probes well. This is really very critical. And the interview guide, this is one reason that it's useful if there's simply 5 to 7 broad questions after doing a couple of interviews. Those will be embedded in your mind. It's not very good for an interaction if the interviewer is looking down, reading their paper. A critical part of this process means interviewing. is that you need to be very comfortable and casual in your communication of the introduction. The purpose of the study and confidentiality assurance so that the interview feels like a comfortable interaction from the beginning. Rehearse that introduction, that you could get a complete confidence while you are interacting with your respondent. Beware of power differentials. In the room, this happens when you know large teams of people with various credentials, background, expertise to the field. There are always power differentials that underlie these dynamics, and being aware of those insensitive to those can be really very important to create a safe space for open dialogues. Then lastly, be comfortable with silence and so pause. Listen, let the responding compose themselves, bring their thoughts to order, and then speak again. And so you need to be comfortable with such type of silences, and even it can be up to 7 seconds. 7 second pause is something that I think all of us struggle with. I know I do, but it's very important interview dynamic. So it need to be considered. A very important thing while you are conducting interview, just put on your qualitative researcher hat. So again, don't bring the kind of prior knowledge or programmatic knowledge or policy knowledge to the table, but rather you need to be open, inquisitive mind, non-judgmental researcher, and be sure that the respondent perceives you in that room speaking judicially. So being careful with those probes, while it's helpful to have those potential probes, content probes, or the stylistic probes we reviewed briefly, it is important to speak judicially, not to use those very freely, because that has a strong potential to lead the respondent in a specific direction. So it's these all tips are really very important, but at the same time, as a research student or as a researcher, you keep to always kindle your common sense, what is appropriate according to the situation. Thanks. What can be the takeaway of this talk? You need to think about how this all information can be useful with your project. Thank you.